Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I am coming right off of watching the Elon Musk SpaceX presentation. There was an awful lot of stuff to go through. I'm going to reserve some detailed discussions for later on because there's just a ton of stuff to talk about, but you can see, as I was taking notes as we were going on, I'm just going to spend a quick moment here tonight to kind of go over a whole bunch of the highlights and things that I think are the most important for you to get out of this, whether you watch the presentation or not. I'll try to throw in my own thoughts where it makes sense. And at the end, I'm going to show you a launch video that I thought was quite good. It's all CG, of course, it's not real, but it was a very, very good launch sequence render that I think is excellent. I'm just going to end the video with that because I don't see any way to end it better than that. Anyway, to start with, Elon Musk said that it's getting to Mars is their most important thing. He reiterated that several times in different ways. And then, you know, he did take account of the fact that people often say that we spend too much money on space. And I think he was also dealing with the fact that, you know, they've got the whole billionaires in space kind of deal with Jeff Bezos and Sir Richard Branson, that people are saying these guys are just doing this for fun. He's like, no, it's not. He said, actually, we should keep most of the money that we spend being spent on Earth. And remember, Elon Musk didn't say this, but remember that all the money that's spent in space, at least right now, like stays on Earth, right? Except for a couple of pieces of stuff that end up orbiting the Earth or going to the moon or something. There's very little stuff that actually leaves the Earth. Almost all of the money stays on Earth. Now, if eventually we create a civilization on Mars and there's a whole other society, that's going to be different. But for right now, all the money that people say we're spending on space really isn't being spent on space. It's being spent right here on Earth. So just remember that. But anyway, he suggested spending somewhere around 0.5% of the national, I think it was the national US budget, but also potentially the global GDP on exploring space. So he was saying a tiny fraction, but that we need to do that. I love this too. He actually said that they're not done yet creating this thing and they don't know if it's going to succeed, but success is one of the possible outcomes. And I thought that was fantastic. And I actually talked to Dan, who's the guy who works on my t-shirts and stuff, while we were watching this. By the way, if you're not on Patreon, you should be on Patreon because we were discussing this on Discord while the presentation was happening. So you could have been part of that. So definitely check that out. Check out the link in the description for more of that. But anyway, I think we're going to put that on a t-shirt. We'll have success is one of the possible outcomes as one of the t-shirts. So anyway, super cool. The next really big thing he talked about was that 3 Starship launches per week for 1 year. So that's a lot of launches, right? That would be 3 Starship launches a week for a whole year. Would take 2 mass, like the amount of mass that it would get to orbit would be the same amount of mass that all the way from 1957 when the original Sputnik went into orbit all the way up to 2022. It would be the equivalent of that. That would be the same amount of mass to orbit just on 1 Starship that was launching 3 times a week to get things into space. So that is pretty incredible. He also made a note that I thought was really interesting, was that we need more ships than boosters because we'll get the boosters back in approximately 6 minutes. He says 2 minutes up. So it's going to be apparently a fairly short flight because the Falcon 9 first stage booster is about a 2.5 minute flight up, and then I think it's around 7 minutes before it gets back. But they're predicting 2 minutes up, 4 minutes back down again, land, you know, and so therefore you will need more of the Starships than you will boosters because the boosters will go up, they'll come back, they can be refueled. He's saying like 1 per, yes, can be reused every single hour. So a booster could go up, come back, be refueled, checked out again, put another Starship on top of it, it's ready to go in an hour. And in the meantime, the Starships, or just what they're calling ships at this point, will be up in orbit for several orbits. So those can be reused every 6 hours. So if you're trying to go full cadence, you'd need 6 times as many Starships as you would need boosters. I don't think they'll get to that, but he was talking about multiple launches per day. So pretty incredible. One of the themes that he kept sort of repeating, and it started off here and repeated later on, especially in the Q&A and stuff, is that the more they can produce of these things, he said that will cure a lot of ills. So basically, if they have a very high production rate, they can, you know, if they lose a booster or if it doesn't turn around as fast, they can just substitute it out with another one or something. So that's an interesting factor, but they're really talking about high production rates. And just wait till we get to the Raptor 2 engines. Anyway, so he also, he reiterated something that I'm pretty sure he said before, is that Mars needs about 1 million tons of stuff from Earth to Mars to make it a fully self-sustaining civilization or entity or city or whatever you want to call it, civilization there. So in other words, if things stopped coming from Earth, Mars would die if it didn't have approximately 1 million tons of stuff from Earth before that happened. So that's really interesting. He also said, you know, you have to have every single ingredient for that to work. You can't have 99% of the ingredients. It'd be like going on a sea voyage back in the day when they didn't know about vitamin C and they didn't take vitamin C with them, and then people died from scurvy because they had almost everything else except they didn't have vitamin C. So you need, you know, if you didn't have vitamin C on Mars, you'd be pretty well screwed. So anyway, you need to have that kind of stuff. You need to have 100% of the things you need to survive, or else you won't survive. He also said, really interestingly, and I hadn't really thought about this before, we need to get to Mars as soon as possible. The window might be open only for a short time. In other words, it's taken 4.5 billion years to get to where we are right now, and we're just getting to the point where we can actually get a civilization going on another planet. It's the first time it's been possible, and who knows how long it could take in the future. And we really only have a few 100 million years before the sun gets hot enough that it's going to boil the oceans off on Earth. So we need to get out. Now, a couple 100 million years is a long time. I realize that, but you know, in the grand scheme of things, if we're going to get out, we need to do it now. We can't depend on another civilization in the future doing that. It may not happen, and we might not get off the planet. So I totally agree with him here. There's a kind of urgency to this that we need to really think about getting to Mars. He then followed that up with the interesting Elon Musk sales pitch to go to Mars. It's going to be cramped, difficult, dangerous, and you might die, and it'll be super hard. So there you go. It's going to clearly take a certain type of person who is going to want to go there. The first voyages to Mars are going to be uncomfortable. Certainly the ones that stay there are going to be pretty difficult. So it's not, fortunately we have 7 or so billion people on the planet. So hopefully we can garner a few thousand or something who will be willing to go in those first couple of waves. After a few waves of this, and again, think about settling different parts of the globe and stuff. The first people who go to these places, it's not so easy to go there. So they have to be willing to suffer, and many of them could die. Right? It's something that could happen. And that's just the fact of, it's the fact of the world. So anyway, that's okay. But if you're that kind of person, then you should definitely be signing up with Elon Musk right away. I'm not. I don't think I'd like to live that kind of life and probably die in the meantime. But there are people who do that. So that's awesome. We then get to the stats of this ship. It's 50 meters tall, 9 meters diameter, 1,200 tons of propellant, 1,500 tons of thrust, and the payload is 100 to 150 tons to LEO, to low Earth orbit. So that's really interesting. Elon also said that they're going to stretch both the booster and the Starship probably so they can put more fuel into it. So over time, he said, they're hoping to get to like 200 tons rather than 150. They will definitely need orbital refilling, not refueling. He kept saying that over and over again. He said 3.5 times more oxygen than methane. So it's mostly refilling of oxygen, not refueling of methane. So anyway, just in case you want to think about that stuff. So anyway, so there's going to need to be orbital refilling, mostly of oxygen, to get these starships from low Earth orbit to the moon or to Mars. And interestingly enough, it doesn't take that much more energy to get to Mars than it does to get to the moon. So rather interesting that because of just the nature of orbital mechanics and everything, that's the way it sort of works out. All right, so anyway, the heat shield, he did talk about that. They've got a thing called the bakery at Cape Canaveral, and we're going to hear more about Cape Canaveral in a moment here, where they've been working on extreme heat, not expensive, and it shares technology with roofing tiles, which is rather interesting. I think that's actually kind of cool that it does that. Then Elon recircled back to orbital refilling. He said they were going to do an animation of the orbital refilling, but it looked wrong. If you notice, interesting that he said they were going to play some Barry White, because it's now, it's actually, I was going to say belly to belly, but it's actually back to back, honestly, because the belly's kind of, I think, the place with the heat shields. But anyway, for the longest time, they had the two starships mating together butt to butt, and they were doing the refilling. But now it looks like it's going to be belly to belly or back to back again. So they're going to take the sides that are not the heat shield sides, but the raw stainless steel sides, and they're going to put those together. They must have some sort of fueling options or something like that. They'll mate them together and they will transfer fuel. You could definitely see that one of them was a cargo, fuel tanker kind of thing, and the other one had the glass and everything for the human beings in it. Elon did note that the Starship is going to have twice the thrust of a Saturn V and 3,400 tons of propellant. So it's really rather interesting how huge this thing is and how powerful it is. He then went on to talk about the tower. He said that the tower, the big thing with the chopsticks and all that stuff, went from design to completion in 13 months, and the tower is as complex as the booster or the ship, which is pretty remarkable to say something like that. So you can see that it's got chopstick arms, but also when you watch the animation, it's also got gripper arms for the booster on the bottom. So it'll catch it, it'll put it down, and then it has like a whole secondary little arm thing that's going to grab the bottom part while it puts the Starship on top. So that's really interesting. He then went on to talk about the Raptor 2, which sounds like is an absolutely ridiculous beast. It is half as much cost as the original one. Super much simpler. It has 230 tons of thrust and will eventually get to 250, he's hoping. He said they've actually maxed it out at like 247 so far, so really close to 250. But of course they have to be able to run it over time. Anyway, but at the same time, it costs half as much as number one. And when you look at pictures of one versus the other, the Raptor 2 is like ridiculously much simpler than the first one was. He says it's a spectacular piece of engineering and mind-bogglingly difficult. And it is essential for making the Starship work. You have to have something that's reusable, that's simple, that you can produce quickly. He goes on to talk about this in the Q&A, so I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Then he actually talks about why Starbase in Texas. And this all sounded like a play for the government to be like, hey, you guys should be nice to us. We're being nice to you. You should treat us well. You should give us the environmental approvals and all of that stuff that needs to happen. So anyway, I think that was the underlying message with all of that. And part of that message was that he talked about how they're going to be building another one of these launch towers in Cape Canaveral, and they already have the environmental impact approval from Florida to launch in Cape Canaveral. So I think it's one of those things where he's like, hey, if you don't give us this approval, we're just going to shop everything to Cape Canaveral. He did say that they want to treat Starbase, Texas, as an R&D, an advanced R&D facility. They want to launch things from there. They want redundancy, but he also made it very clear that in something like a half a year, 6 to 8 months, they could transfer everything to Cape Canaveral if need be. So that sounded like a little bit of a veiled threat on his part. I mean, it was a nice thing. He didn't ever say that, but that's what it seemed like to me. So anyway, we get the workhorse operational stuff at Cape Canaveral and the R&D in Texas. That's a really rather interesting little switch back and forth. He then, of course, thanked the area and the village, and you need that support and everything. So, and it got a big round of applause, so that's really cool. Elon then talked about several upcoming missions, including Starlinks, which they're going to be using as their test bed. Essentially, they're going to launch Starlinks as their, instead of launching dummy payload for these starships, and probably the very first ones, they'll launch dummy stuff. But once they think that they've got it working, they will actually be launching Starlink rather than dummy payloads. So that's interesting. NASA human spaceflight mission to the moon. He said they're going to get that done. That's the human landing system and everything. Dear Moon with Miyazawa. And then he said future announcements that people will be super excited about, but he wasn't going to steal their thunder, so he would let the other people say that. So clearly there are other people who are interested. And at the end of his regular presentation, he said, let's make this real, let's make this real, right? So that was pretty impressive. He got rather enthusiastic about making all of this stuff real. A few of the highlights from the Q&A part of it, he said that Starship might be the lowest cost means of long distance Earth-to-Earth transport. So he said 1/3 to 1/2 of the way around the world. So something like 20 hours versus 1 hour. And if the Starship can get from one place to another in 1 hour, where it takes 20 hours for a plane to fly that distance, you could fly the Starship, 15 or 20 times during the day rather than one time during the day, so that it actually would become more cost efficient to fly the Starship than it would be to fly an airplane. And certainly people would find it convenient because they would want to get there faster themselves. But he was also talking about high value cargo and things like that as well. Also, again, he talked about high flight rate and lots of starships. He said they need to get this to get the costs down. And I was thinking about Wright's Law, over and over again, you got to double the production. So if you can make one starship, it costs this much money. If you make two, it costs some percentage less than that. If you make four, it costs some percentage less than that. If you make 8, it costs some percentage less, and you get this steady decline. And if you haven't seen my Wright's Law episode, you should definitely watch that. It's about Tesla, but whatever. Anyway, so I was thinking about Wright's Law and how the more they can produce of these things, the more cost effective all of this is. He says that the development costs of Starship thus far have been about 5 to 10% of the cost of the Saturn V, which was really interesting. And he's confident that they will get to orbit this year, so woohoo. And in light of that, he said that they are aiming to produce one Raptor 2 engine every single day. And he said next week he thought they'd be able to produce 5 next week. So they're already almost at that cadence. And he said that they produce about 1 booster per month. So that's the whole booster with 33 engines on it. Right now it has 29, but they'll eventually have 33. And he said that that's 1 to 2 orders of magnitude more efficient than anybody else has been able to do. And if they get this working, they'll be able to do 100 tons to useful low Earth orbit for $10 million in time. And that is a pretty ridiculous number. And then some folks from Reddit and Tim Dodd, the everyday astronaut, asked about the Raptor 2 engine, and he went into some detail. You could tell that he really loves the Reddit, and he loves the geek crowd because he gave everybody else kind of perfunctory answers, but he really went into it here. So he talked about the Raptor 2, almost a complete redesign. They deleted a lot of parts. We all know that Elon loves to delete parts. He said the inducers in the turbo pumps are more robust. They changed flanges, which are putting pieces together like this into welds. He says, I hate flanges. Better to weld it all together because you have 700 or 800 bar in parts of the engine. The pre-burner controllers are consolidated. They're looking to get no shroud, which is the fireproof protection around the thing. So they want a fireproof engine. Higher chamber pressures up to 330 bar in the chamber itself. Remove choke points, less loss. And then to Tim Dodd, he said their biggest challenge right now is the chamber, the combustion chamber itself is melting. So that's their biggest challenge they're trying to overcome. He's like, we're working on it, they're trying it. He said they're gonna get 5 or 6 of these things produced next week, and they're aiming for 7+ by next month. So this is a short-term goal, not a long-term goal. So that's really, really cool. As for life support, he said longer term to go to Mars and stuff, they need a whole new life support. It's not a priority right now. So you can see his timeline is starting to stretch out. We're not looking at 2024 launching these things anymore for sure. But that they could scale up the Dragon life support system for 1 to 2 to 3 week missions. So, regular low Earth orbit stuff, going around the moon, all of that kind of stuff they can do with a larger Dragon capsule life support system. So he's not too worried about that. So that's really cool. As far as regulatory approval, he said if regulatory approval is somewhere around mid-March, that they should technologically be able to go around that same time. As for later this year, he said that either Phoebos or Daemos, one of the 2 oil platforms, and Cape Canaveral's Launchpad 39A, both of those would be able to launch Starships by the end of this year. So that's pretty crazy. I can't believe it'll actually be that, but we'll see. And then let's go ahead and finish this video off with the SpaceX video that they did. Again, this is all CG, none of it's real, but pay attention to a few things. Number 1, they've even got condensation and stuff. It's a really high class, high quality thing. This is what I do for a living, so I'm a pretty decent judge of that. So somebody worked really, really hard on this. I also like the kind of quasi 2001 music. That was very cool. You can see that the 2 ships that mate together are crew and propellant starships, and they're different designs. And you can also see that when they're on Mars, there's many starships arriving on Mars at the same time, and they're wearing SpaceX spacesuits. So anyway, that's a real quick recap of all of the highlights that I saw from the presentation. If you enjoyed this video, please do like it and consider subscribing for more of this kind of stuff. You all know about the Patreon stuff, about the merch store, all of that is in the description. Check it out. And I'm going to leave you with this amazing video and with Elon Musk's ending by saying, let's make it real, let's make it real.
Let's make this real. Let's make this real. Yeah. Cool.